Marco Il Serpent Rossi, once the most feared mafia boss in Naples, was shot 6 times, left for dead, and emerged not as a criminal, but as a man transformed by faith, secrets, and the relentless fight for redemption. Marco Il Serpent, Rossi was born in the narrow, winding streets of Naples, a city where history and poverty collided in sharp contrast. From a young age, Marco learned that survival required cunning and courage. His father worked long hours in a local factory, barely able to make ends meet, while his mother tried to shield him from the dangers of their neighborhood. But the streets themselves became his education. He watched older boys run small cons, steal from unsuspecting tourists, and earn respect through fear. Marco absorbed everything: the gestures, the threats, the rewards that came with taking risks others were too scared to take. By his early teens, Marco was no longer a spectator. He began with minor thefts, sneaking into stores after closing hours, and learning the art of disappearing into the night. Unlike many who got caught or gave up, Marco had a talent for reading people, understanding their fears, their weaknesses, and how to manipulate them. That talent became his first tool in a life that would soon become dominated by power and danger. At 16, Marco joined a local gang that controlled a small district in Naples. The gang operated under the shadow of larger mafia families, and every misstep could be fatal. Marco's intelligence, combined with an uncanny ability to stay calm under pressure, allowed him to climb the ranks faster than anyone expected. Within 2 years, he was making decisions that could cost lives, and yet he approached them with a cold efficiency that both impressed and terrified his peers. As he grew older, Marco's reputation spread. He was known for his sharp mind, his ruthlessness, and his ability to predict rivals' moves before they acted. He didn't rely solely on violence. He used negotiation, bribery, and subtle intimidation to expand his influence. Small shops, underground gambling dens, and even some legitimate businesses came under his control. People whispered about him in the alleys, some in awe, others in fear, calling him Il Serpent, because like a serpent, he could strike swiftly, silently, and without warning. Despite the power and wealth, there was a restlessness in Marco that few noticed. Luxurious cars, designer suits, and lavish parties filled his days, but there were nights when he would sit alone, staring out at the city lights reflecting on the water, wondering if this life of dominance and bloodshed was all there was. The streets that had taught him survival now seemed to trap him, and for the first time, Marco felt a gnawing sense of emptiness. He started noticing the fragility of his empire. Rival gangs lurked in the shadows. Law enforcement kept a watchful eye, and betrayal was always a heartbeat away. Marco understood that every moment of power was borrowed, and every miscalculation could cost him everything, including his life. Yet he pushed forward, driven by ambition, fear, and the intoxicating taste of control, unaware that this relentless pursuit would eventually lead him to a confrontation that would change everything. By the time he turned 25, Marco was no longer just a member of the mafia. He was a rising don, a man whose name alone could command respect or strike terror. He had everything most people could only dream of, yet the restlessness inside him quietly grew, hinting that the life he had built on fear and cunning might one day demand a price far higher than he ever imagined. Marco's rise in the mafia brought him wealth, power, and influence, but it also made him a target. The streets of Naples were not forgiving, and every alliance carried the risk of betrayal. Rival gangs watched him closely, studying his every move, waiting for the right moment to strike. Marco had survived minor attacks before, but nothing could prepare him for the night that would change his life forever. It was a warm summer evening when Marco was walking through a quiet alleyway after a late meeting with his lieutenants. The city was alive with lights reflecting off the cobblestone streets, and the distant sounds of scooters and chatter masked the danger lurking nearby. Without warning, a group of men emerged from the shadows, guns raised and eyes cold. There was no negotiation, no warning, just the sharp crack of bullets, and the smell of gunpowder. Marco felt the impact immediately as one shot ripped through his shoulder, another tore across his chest, and yet another grazed his leg. Pain exploded in every nerve, but adrenaline kept him moving. His instincts honed from years of violence, guiding him to a nearby doorway for cover. 6 bullets had found their mark, and yet, against all odds, Marco survived. Collapsing behind the doorway, he felt the warm, sticky burn of blood on his skin and realized that his life, which had seemed invincible, was suddenly fragile. The attackers fled as quickly as they had appeared, leaving him alone with the echoes of gunfire and the realization that death had come for him and missed. It was not only the physical pain that struck him, but the shock of betrayal. Someone had given away his movements, someone he had trusted, and the knowledge stung far worse than the bullets themselves. The days that followed were a blur of hospital rooms, surgeries, and sleepless nights. Marco's body healed slowly, but his mind was restless. He could not shake the image of the gunman, the sound of bullets tearing through the air, or the thought that his empire could crumble in a single night. The attack had shown him the fragility of power built on fear alone. Every handshake, every smile, every alliance could mask a dagger aimed at his back. The life he had built with cunning and ruthlessness now seemed perilously thin, and for the first time he began to question the path he had chosen. During his recovery, Marco spent hours staring at the ceiling, thinking about mortality, loyalty, and purpose. Memories of the people he had hurt, the rivals he had eliminated, and the constant betrayals that surrounded him haunted his thoughts. He realized that survival was no longer just about strength or intelligence. It was about something deeper, something he had ignored for years. The attack had not only wounded his body, but had opened a crack in his armor, allowing a flicker of introspection to seep through. By the time he left the hospital, Marco was a changed man. He returned to his empire with caution, aware that every step could be his last. The bullets that had torn through him were a reminder of mortality, a warning that power was fleeting and life could end in an instant. But hidden within the fear was a spark, a curiosity about a world beyond violence, a sense that perhaps there was another way to live. That spark would grow, slowly at first, until it became a force strong enough to challenge everything he had once believed in. As Marco recovered from the gunshot wounds that had nearly killed him, the world outside the hospital seemed both familiar and alien. Naples had not changed, yet he saw it through different eyes. The narrow streets, once symbols of opportunity and power, now appeared fragile and fleeting, like the lives of the people who walked them. Every face he passed reminded him of the delicate balance between life and death, loyalty and betrayal. The realization that he had come so close to dying stirred a restlessness he could no longer ignore. In the sterile quiet of his hospital room, Marco began to reflect on his past with a clarity he had never allowed himself. Memories of violence, of men he had ordered killed, of families he had terrorized, flooded his mind. The power he had wielded so effortlessly suddenly felt hollow. Money, fear, and influence had given him everything the world seemed to value, yet they could not shield him from the cold finality of a bullet. The thought that all of his life's work could end in an instant was terrifying, and for the first time, he questioned the meaning of his existence. Unable to sleep, Marco turned to reading. He explored philosophy, history, and religious texts, seeking something that might provide answers or comfort. In the pages of books, he discovered the idea of purpose beyond power, of discipline and morality beyond wealth. Stories of redemption, of men who had turned their lives around, resonated deeply with him. One text in particular, a treatise on faith and spiritual reflection, captured his attention. Its words were simple yet profound, speaking of inner peace, accountability, and the search for meaning in a chaotic world. Marco felt a strange connection to the ideas, as if they had been waiting for him to notice. The days turned into weeks, and Marco's curiosity about faith grew. He began to see his life in sharper contrast, a life built on fear, manipulation, and violence versus a life that could be guided by principles and reflection. The dichotomy haunted him. He realized that no amount of wealth or dominance could erase the consequences of his actions or the emptiness he felt inside. The gunfire that had nearly ended his life now echoed metaphorically in his thoughts, reminding him of mortality and the possibility of transformation. As he navigated the streets of Naples again, each corner, each alley, each familiar face reminded him of fragility. Marco began to observe people differently, not as pawns or threats, but as individuals with their own fears, struggles, and potential for change. His old instincts for manipulation and intimidation began to clash with this emerging sense of empathy and curiosity about a higher purpose. By the end of his recovery, Marco's perspective had shifted dramatically. The adrenaline and bravado that had defined his youth no longer dominated his thoughts. In its place was a restless longing for meaning, for a path that could offer him more than fear and control. He began to wonder if survival itself was not enough, if perhaps there was a way to live a life that mattered, not just in the eyes of the Mafia, but in a moral and spiritual sense. The seeds of transformation had been planted, and though he could not yet see the full path ahead, Marco sensed that his life was about to take a direction no one in the streets of Naples could have predicted. After months of reflection and study, Marco made a decision that would shock anyone who knew him. He chose to embrace Islam. The choice was not sudden, but a culmination of countless nights spent reading, questioning, and searching for a path that could give his life meaning beyond violence. It was a deeply personal transformation, one he had to keep secret, for revealing it too soon could mean death. In the world of the Mafia, faith was seen as weakness, and any deviation from the unspoken code of brutality was a liability. Marco knew that to survive, he had to practice his new beliefs in silence. He began his conversion quietly, first through prayer in the stillness of his private room, then by adopting the principles and rituals of his newfound faith. Each action was deliberate, each moment of reflection a step away from the life he had known and toward something wholly unfamiliar. His routine became structured, prayers at specific times, readings that nurtured his soul, and meditation that offered a sense of inner calm he had never experienced before. The discipline was unlike anything he had followed in the streets, and yet Marco found it strangely empowering. The physical dangers of his world did not disappear, but the internal transformation gave him strength he had never felt. The fear that had once driven him, fear of rivals, of betrayal, of death, was replaced with a steady determination rooted in spiritual conviction. He began to see his life differently. The violence he had once wielded so effortlessly no longer defined him. He understood that survival and power were fleeting, but faith and purpose could endure. Despite the clarity of his new path, secrecy was crucial. Marco could not trust anyone completely, not even those closest to him. His lieutenants, men who had once followed his every order without question, might see his transformation as weakness or betrayal. In the Mafia, trust was fragile, and deviation from the code invited disaster. Every interaction became a careful performance. Marco maintained his persona as a ruthless don while nurturing a spiritual life that existed entirely in the shadows. It was a constant balancing act, a dangerous dance between outward appearance and inner truth. The duality of his existence weighed on him. By day, he managed his empire with precision, enforcing rules, collecting debts, and maintaining fear-driven respect. By night, he prayed, studied scripture, and contemplated the meaning of his past choices. The contrast was stark, but it revealed to Marco a new kind of power, the ability to change from within, even in the midst of chaos. Each prayer, each moment of reflection, strengthened his resolve and gave him hope that redemption might be possible. The secret conversion also forced him to confront his past like never before. He could no longer ignore the lives he had destroyed, the families he had terrorized, or the betrayals he had enacted. Guilt was no longer something to bury. It became a mirror reflecting the man he wanted to become. Marco realized that change would not be easy, that danger lurked at every corner, but he felt a determination stronger than fear. His faith became both a shield and a guide, offering direction in a life where every choice had previously been dictated by survival and greed. In this delicate, hidden transformation, Marco discovered a paradox. By renouncing the old life in his heart, he was not weakening. He was gaining a strength that no bullet, betrayal, or threat could touch. Yet the shadows of the Mafia loomed close, and Marco knew that living this new truth would test not only his faith, but his very survival. The Mafia was unforgiving, and secrecy was a fragile shield. Marco's private transformation did not go unnoticed for long. Among his closest lieutenants, one man harbored suspicion. Antonio Il Corvo Bianchi had long observed Marco's changing habits, the hours spent alone, the quiet moments of reflection, the subtle avoidance of certain routines that had once been sacred to the gang. To Antonio, these were not signs of faith or redemption, but of weakness, a crack in the armor of the empire. In a world where weakness was fatal, even the slightest deviation from the code could spark lethal consequences. Rumors began to circulate quietly at first, whispers carried from one shadowed room to another, growing like wildfire in dry grass. Marco had always ruled with fear and respect, but now the perception of doubt crept into the minds of his associates. Some saw his restraint as prudence, others saw it as betrayal. The delicate balance of power he had spent years constructing now hung by a thread. Every glance, every word, every movement was scrutinized. Marco realized that his faith, which had given him peace, had also painted a target on his back. Betrayal came in subtle forms. Deals that had once been honored were delayed, shipments were mysteriously intercepted, and trusted allies began questioning his decisions openly. Marco understood that the threat was not only from rivals outside the Mafia, but from within, from the very men he had considered family. The realization was terrifying. Those who had once followed his orders without hesitation now saw him as an obstacle, a liability, or even a traitor. Despite the mounting danger, Marco refused to abandon his new path. His faith had become a source of inner strength, a lens through which he could see the world more clearly. He began to plan meticulously, analyzing every relationship, every allegiance, and every potential threat. Survival now required more than physical prowess. It demanded strategy, foresight, and the ability to anticipate treachery. Marco's mind became a chessboard, each piece representing a potential enemy or ally, each move calculated to protect both his life and his secret. The tension reached a breaking point one night when Antonio arranged a meeting under the guise of discussing business. Marco, fully aware of the danger, attended with caution. The room was thick with unspoken threats and hidden motives. Marco sensed any wrong word or gesture could trigger violence. It was a reminder that in the Mafia, betrayal was never hypothetical. It was immediate, personal, and often deadly. This period of constant vigilance tested Marco's resolve. Every step outside his home, every conversation, and even every glance in the mirror reminded him of the precariousness of his position. Yet, with every challenge, his faith fortified him. He no longer reacted with fear or rage alone. He approached threats with patience and clarity, using intellect rather than intimidation to navigate deadly waters. Each narrow escape from exposure reinforced the belief that his survival was intertwined, not only with cunning, but with a higher purpose. Marco realized that conversion had changed the rules of the game for him entirely. His world was no longer defined solely by fear and loyalty, but by the delicate balance of secrecy, morality, and strategy. Betrayal could strike at any moment, yet he had learned that true strength was not in domination alone. It was in the courage to stand firm, even when surrounded by enemies, and the wisdom to act with precision and restraint. The life he had once controlled through violence was now a world where survival required both spiritual and mental mastery, and Marco had no intention of failing. Marco's life became a continuous game of evasion. The streets of Naples, once a domain he ruled with confidence, now felt like a trap, each alley a reminder of betrayal, each shadow a potential assassin. He knew that remaining in Italy was too dangerous. Antonio and others who had discovered fragments of his faith were patient predators, and Marco could not afford to underestimate them. Survival meant leaving the familiar behind, abandoning the empire he had built, and moving into the unknown. He began traveling across Europe under false identities, carefully choosing cities where he could blend into the crowd while keeping an eye on news reports and mafia activity back home. Paris, Berlin, Madrid, each city offered anonymity, but none offered true safety. Marco was constantly aware of the invisible eyes that might follow him, the unseen traps that could end his life without warning. Hotels became temporary homes, streets became endless mazes, and every interaction required careful calculation. He moved like a shadow, leaving no trace, yet everywhere he went, the weight of his past clung to him. Despite the constant danger, Marco's faith gave him a sense of purpose that pure survival had never offered. He discovered that the discipline and reflection instilled by his spiritual practice were not just tools for peace, they were tools for strategy. Calm and patient, he could think clearly in situations that would have previously triggered panic or violence. When a gang from Naples appeared in Barcelona, attempting to track him, Marco was able to avoid confrontation entirely, using misdirection, careful timing, and observation to evade them without firing a single shot. His survival no longer relied on brute force. It relied on intellect and the calculated application of restraint. During these years on the run, Marco also began to subtly dismantle parts of his old empire. Through intermediaries, he redirected resources away from violence, undermining illicit networks without exposing his location. He worked quietly, a ghost manipulating outcomes from afar, ensuring that some control remained, but with minimal risk. He used his influence to prevent innocent lives from being harmed, a stark contrast to the ruthless domination of his past. For the first time, power became a tool for protection rather than fear. Loneliness was his constant companion. Marco had left family, friends, and familiar streets behind. Human connection was limited to fleeting interactions and cautious alliances, yet in the solitude, he found clarity. Nights spent alone in unfamiliar cities were devoted to prayer and reflection, to understanding not only the dangers around him, but the dangers within his anger, guilt, and the lingering impulses of his former self. Each day, he learned to navigate life as a man of caution, faith, and intellect. But danger was never far. Rumors of his whereabouts traveled slowly through mafia networks, and Marco knew that one misstep could end his life. Each narrow escape reinforced a lesson he had learned the hard way. True survival depended on foresight, discipline, and a commitment to a higher purpose. With every city he left behind, he became less a criminal on the run and more a man reshaping his existence, balancing between the shadows of his past and the promise of a life guided by faith. In this precarious existence, Marco discovered a new kind of power, a power that came not from fear or violence, but from the strength to live with purpose amidst constant peril. Over the years, Marco's life began to transform in ways he could never have imagined. The constant flight across Europe had taught him discipline, patience, and the value of foresight, but it had also awakened a deep desire to use his knowledge and influence for something greater than survival. The violence that had once defined him now felt hollow, a reminder of the life he had left behind. Slowly, he began to see opportunities to make amends, to protect those who could not protect themselves, and to turn his past power into a force for good. Marco began quietly funding shelters in neighborhoods plagued by crime, providing education for children whose lives were at risk of being swallowed by the same darkness he had once navigated. His donations were anonymous, but they were strategic. targeting areas where small interventions could prevent cycles of violence from repeating. He also supported victims of organized crime, helping families recover from the devastation he had once contributed to. While he could not undo the past, he could influence the future, and each small act of protection became a step toward redemption. At the same time, Marco continued to observe his former empire from afar. He saw the chaos that emerged when power was left unchecked, the way fear could spiral into destruction, and the collateral damage of unchecked ambition. Using discreet intermediaries, he began to subtly manipulate events to prevent unnecessary bloodshed, carefully removing threats or redirecting conflicts without drawing attention to himself. Every action required precision and patience. One wrong move could expose him and endanger everything he had rebuilt. His reputation began to shift in the shadows. While his former allies and rivals remembered him as a ruthless don, word of a mysterious figure who intervened to protect the vulnerable began circulating quietly. Marco became a legend in his own way, not through fear, but through influence used with caution and compassion. He found that true power no longer lay in commanding loyalty through terror, but in shaping outcomes without being seen, in steering lives towards safety rather than destruction. Yet the path of redemption was never without danger. The Mafia never forgot, and enemies of the past were always ready to settle old scores. Marco learned to navigate these threats with a combination of patience, cunning, and spiritual guidance. His faith had taught him restraint, helping him temper impulses that could have once led to revenge or violence. In its place, he embraced calculated interventions, strategic patience, and the understanding that survival and redemption were intertwined. As years passed, Marco's internal transformation became evident to him, even if the world outside remained unaware. The restless, violent man who had once struck fear into entire neighborhoods had evolved into a figure defined by reflection, strategy, and careful compassion. He had discovered that life could be lived with purpose, even in the aftermath of bloodshed. By the end of this period, Marco had become more than a survivor. He was a symbol of change, a living paradox, a man once feared, now quietly revered for acts of protection and redemption. His story was whispered among those who had witnessed the aftermath of his influence, growing into a legend of the Mafia boss who had traded violence for faith, fear for strategy, and chaos for measured justice. Through the shadows of his past, Marco had carved a path toward a life that, while dangerous and secret, held the promise of meaning, hope, and a chance at true transformation. Years of careful living, reflection, and quiet intervention had transformed Marco into a figure unrecognizable to those who once feared him. The streets of Naples, and even the broader reaches of Europe, still remembered his former reputation. But the man who now moved among shadows was no longer the ruthless don who had once commanded loyalty through fear. Instead, he had become a symbol of unexpected change, a man whose survival had depended not only on cunning and violence, but on faith, discipline, and a relentless pursuit of redemption. Marco's legacy was complicated. Families he had once harmed cautiously accepted his assistance, understanding that the violence of the past could never be erased, but that his influence could now protect rather than destroy. Children in neighborhoods once dominated by fear found themselves attending schools he had secretly funded, while local shelters and clinics offered resources that were quietly provided by the man who had once ruled through terror. Marco's hand was unseen, his presence almost mythical, yet his actions had tangible, life-altering consequences. Despite the quiet nature of his work, Marco's story began to spread, first through whispers and rumors, then through stories told by those whose lives he had touched. People spoke of the Mafia boss, who had vanished after surviving multiple assassination attempts, only to reappear, not with vengeance, but with compassion. The contrast between his former brutality and his present interventions became legendary, creating a mystique that blurred the line between myth and reality. Marco understood that this new form of influence, one built on secrecy, morality, and strategy, was more powerful than the fear he had once commanded. Yet Marco's life remained dangerous. Old enemies never fully forgot, and former allies were quick to exploit perceived weakness. Each day required vigilance, every step a careful negotiation between survival and purpose. But the lessons he had learned through faith and reflection enabled him to navigate these threats with precision. Marco's mind, honed by years of fleeing assassins and analyzing betrayal, now applied itself to preserving life rather than taking it. He avoided confrontations, neutralized risks quietly, and moved through the world like a shadow with a mission far larger than himself. In private moments, Marco reflected on the journey that had brought him here, from a young man drawn into the seductive power of the Mafia, through near death, betrayal, and introspection, to the cautious yet purposeful existence he now led. He understood the paradox of his life. The man who had been feared above all was now revered in silence for acts of mercy and protection. The very skills that had once facilitated destruction were now being applied to preservation, and he recognized that this balance was his true power. As he looked toward the future, Marco felt a sense of peace that had once been unimaginable. His story, filled with bullets, betrayal, and bloodshed, had taken an unexpected turn, yet it had forged a life of purpose and meaning. Though the shadows of the past remained, he had proven that transformation was possible, that faith and discipline could coexist with survival in a dangerous world. Marco Il Serpent Rossi would always carry the weight of his past, but he had also created a legacy that transcended it, a testament to the human capacity for change, redemption, and the pursuit of a life defined not by fear, but by conscious, deliberate action.